Welcome to the Trend Micro Deep Security 10 for Administrators video series. This collection of videos provides an overview of tasks that may be required as part of your work as an administrator in Deep Security Manager. Multi-tenancy in Deep Security lets you create multiple distinct management environments using a single Deep Security Manager and database server installation. In this video lesson, we will enable multi-tenancy and create multiple tenants, which will be responsible for the creation and management of their own assets. In a typical Deep Security installation, the Deep Security Manager will have access to all of the different protected computers across the network. We have Deep Security agents which are installed on physical servers, virtual servers, and cloud servers throughout the organization. Using multi-tenancy, we can segment that installation into individual collections of devices. In this scenario, Deep Security Manager retains full control over the system, but individual collections of machines or tenants are going to be generated. Each tenant is going to have an administrator which is responsible for the management of the machines and policies within that tenancy. Multi-tenancy allows you to create multiple distinct management environments within your organization using a single installation of Deep Security Manager and a single database. Each tenant will be fully isolated from others, and settings, policies, and events are going to be collected separately for each individual tenant. There are a few typical use cases for multi-tenancy. The first is when you have an organization which is segmented by business units. For example, let's say you're a manufacturing company that has a development team, a marketing team, and a sales team, and you would like each of those teams to be responsible for their own computers, policies, rules, and event information. What you can do is segment the organization into multiple tenants, and each business unit is responsible for their own tenant. Another common use case for multi-tenancy is when you want to provision deep security to customers through a service model. For example, if you're an ISP, you might be reselling security services to customers. So to isolate each customer from another, you can create each customer as a separate tenant. It's important to remember that the original Deep Security Manager installation is going to be the primary tenant, and it's going to retain all of the capabilities of a regular Deep Security installation, but the tenants can be restricted in functionality based on how you're going to set up the individual tenants. Individual tenants will be responsible for the creation and management of their own assets, and that includes their own protected computers, their own users, policies, and rules. All of the event information and configuration information is going to be isolated between tenants. To enable the multi-tenancy capabilities within Deep Security, an activation code is going to be required. Trend Micro will provide the activation code, and this is going to be entered during the enabling of multi-tenancy in the Deep Security Manager web console. Let's switch to the Deep Security Manager web console and enable multi-tenancy and create some individual tenants. So I'm now on the Deep Security Manager computer, and I'm going to log into the Deep Security Manager web console. Now you'll notice that the sign-in dialog box requires a username and password, and this is going to be important because this is going to change once the multi-tenancy has been enabled. So our first task is to enable the feature. Click the administration menu. Under System Settings, go to the Advanced tab, and you'll notice that you have the option to enable multi-tenant mode. There is a note here that says once enabled, multi-tenant mode cannot be disabled. So I'm going to click multi-tenant mode, and we're going to be prompted to enter the activation code. I'm going to provide the activation code and click Next. Next, we're going to select the licensing mode that you wish to implement. There are two options. The first is to inherit licensing from the primary tenant. This option is going to be used when you're enabling multi-tenancy to segment business units within an organization. In this case, all of the tenants are going to be sharing the same license code as the primary tenant. Alternately, if you're setting up deep security in a service model environment, you can use per tenant licensing. In this way, you're going to require your tenants to provide a license themselves when they sign in to the tenant for the first time. So let's click Next and click Finish, and multi-tenancy is going to be enabled in deep security. Click Close. And you'll notice that the system settings have changed to include a new tab as well. In the left-hand frame, you have a new item called Tenants. So on the Tenants tab, this is where you're going to be able to specify functionality that's going to be available to the individual tenants. For example, if you want to allow tenants to use the backup schedule task, run the script schedule task, to run computer discovery, to run port scans, you can enable those settings just by clicking the options within this particular dialog box. Clicking Tenants in the left-hand frame will give you a list of all of the tenants that are currently available in this installation of Deep Security Manager. Currently, we don't have any tenants, so our next task is to create some individual tenants. Click New, and the first thing you're going to provide is the account name. The account name is going to be required when the administrator for this individual tenant logs in. So I'm going to create a new tenant called ABC Co. And I'm going to provide an email address for the administrator within this individual tenant. You can select a locale as well as a time zone for this individual tenant. So let's say this tenant is located in the Eastern time zone. Let's select Eastern Standard Time. And then you're going to provide the username for the administrator. If you have an email server configured, you'll be able to send an email to the administrator to allow them to create a password for logging into the individual tenant. So you can send them a confirmation link, or you can generate a password and send that to the administrator as an email. But in this case, I don't have an email server available, so I'm going to type in the password and I'm going to forward that password to the administrator on that tenant. I have a summary of the details. I'm going to click Finish, and the tenant is going to be created. My first tenant has been successfully created. Let's click Close. You'll notice the tenant is now listed. I'm going to create another tenant so that we have a few to work with, and I'll just repeat the process. And type in the username and the password. My second tenant has been successfully created. Let's click close, and you'll note that the second tenant is now listed. I'm going to log out of the web console as the administrator in tenant 0, and you'll notice that the sign-in dialog box has now been modified. Now that multi-tenancy is enabled, an administrator will have to provide an account name along with their username and password to log into the Deep Security Manager web console. I'm going to log back in as the administrator for tenant 0, and in this case I don't have to provide an account name for this administrator. And you'll notice on the toolbar that this has been changed because it indicates the tenant that you're currently logged in as. So in this case, we're logged into the primary tenancy, or tenant 0, and you're logged in as the administrator. Let's go back to the administration menu, to the tenants list, and we have both of our tenants listed. You'll notice we have the time zone for each individual tenant. You have the state, which is active. You have the database that the information is stored in, and we'll take a look at that in a moment, and the modules that this particular tenant has access to. We can modify which protection modules this tenant will have access to through the properties. So if I right mouse click on the individual tenant and go into properties, on the General tab, you have information such as the locale, time zone, and state for the tenant. Notice that the account name is grayed out, so you can't modify the name of the tenant once it's created, but you could change the locale, the time zone, and their state. Administrators of tenants who are in an active state will be able to log in. You do have the ability to suspend a tenant, and in this case, an administrator in that tenant will not be able to log in. Notice that you have the option to sign in as a tenant. So in this scenario here, the administrator of the primary tenant has the ability to log into each individual tenant. For example, if you're running in a service provider model and your customer contacts you because they're having problems, say for example with a policy or a rule, you could log in as an administrator on that tenant and take a look at how things are configured. Note that there are policies that are available to prevent you from logging in as an administrator on another tenant. The Module tab identifies which protection module this individual tenant will have access to. Currently, it's set to all modules, but you could click Selected Modules and then identify which ones this individual tenant will have access to. So say for example, the ABC company is only licensing integrity monitoring and log inspection services from you, so you just enabled those protection modules. If you're going to be selling security services in a service provider model, the Statistics tab will provide information about how much of the security services have been used by this particular tenant. This is going to be handy for billing your tenants. The Agent Activation tab is going to provide details about the tenant ID and the tenant password. If you're going to be activating agents using a deployment script, to ensure that these agents are activated in the proper tenancy, you're going to provide a tenant ID and a password as part of that script. You can always access the tenant ID and activation code for a particular tenancy from this tab. And the Primary Contacts tab is going to have information about the administrator, their access, and the email address for the administrator. Let's modify the properties for the second tenant and give them access to individual protection modules as well. In this case, we're going to give this tenant access to the firewall protection module and the intrusion prevention protection module. Note under the visible modules column, we're going to see that these individual tenants have access to these protection modules only. So I'm going to sign out as my primary tenant, and I'm going to log in as the individual tenants to take a look at what it looks like as a tenant. Let's sign in with the account name for the first tenant, which is ABC Co. The username is admin_ABC, and let's type in the password. You'll notice up at the top you're logged in as the ABC Co tenant, and you're logged in as the administrator, which is called admin at ABC. If I go to the policies menu and go to common objects rules, you'll notice that this particular tenant only has access to the integrity monitoring rules and the log inspection rules, because those are the only two protection modules that they'll have access to. If I go to my policies list and I go to my Windows policy, for example, you'll notice in the left-hand pane, you only have access to the protection modules that have been enabled for this tenant. Let's log out as this tenant, and let's sign in as our other tenant. So you'll notice in the toolbar we're logged in as the XYZ limited account with the admin_XYZ administrator name. Go to policies, common objects rules, and you'll notice that you only have access to firewall rules and intrusion prevention rules. And if we double click on a policy, you'll notice that you only have access to the protection modules that have been enabled for this tenant. In the database, the individual tenants have been segmented. So let's go into the database software and take a look at what this tenant looks like in the database. So I'm going to provide the password to log into the database server. In this case, we're using the Microsoft SQL server within Deep Security Manager. Expand databases, and you'll notice that you have 3 databases that are created as part of Deep Security. The DSM database is your primary tenant database. So this contains information about the Deep Security Manager installation and information about the individual tenants. And within the database, we also have a separate database for tenant 1 and a separate database for tenant 2. When you're using Microsoft SQL Server as your database, each tenant will have a separate database with its own tables within the database server. We are currently logged in to the XYZ limited tenant. Let's add a computer to this tenant. So click Add Computer, and then you can type in the host name of a machine. Click Finish. The computer has been activated, and you'll note that it only has access to the individual protection modules that have been enabled in this particular tenancy. This computer is now isolated to the XYZ limited tenant. You will not have visibility into this computer from the other tenants. And if you apply policies, those policies will be specific for this particular tenant. and any event details related to this client will be unique to this tenancy as well. This completes the Working in a Multi-Tenant Environment lesson as part of the Trend Micro Deep Security 10 for Administrators video series.